the Agriculture and Natural Resources Budget Committee for Thursday, March 6th. Today we're going to have a couple of informational hearings, compliments of some water specialists. I guess we're past the point of asking for bill introductions, so that's a no-go. So let's get started. First, we're going to hear about the Kansas Reservoir water supply. And we have Mr. John Shelley from the Corps of Engineers here with us today. So John, welcome to committee.
Thank you. So when we're talking about reservoir sedimentation and sustainability, we're really talking about water supply security, because 2/3 of the citizens of Kansas depend on the storage, the water storage in the reservoirs for their water supply. Before a lake is built, all the sediment that washes into the area that is now a lake is just conveyed by the river and it passes downstream. And so this is sediment continuity. All the sediment coming in is also going out. And so this is a scaled view here of the Big Blue River before the dam was built, with the little outline of what the original multi-purpose pool would look like. Just scaled off actual data there in Excel. So we built the dam, and then we've got the slack water from the lake. Now all the sediment that comes in deposits in the lake rather than passing downstream. So the original profile was 1962. Now if you look, that's how much sediment had deposited as of 1983, what that profile looks like. That's what the profile looked like in 2009. And we've got some additional surveys, but just kind of jumping forward with our projections to 2074, that's what the profile will look like. And you think about the original amount of water that was available versus the amount of water that's projected to be available, and it's pretty stark. For a few of the lakes in Kansas, it's very stark. For all of the lakes in Kansas, they're all filling in to some degree every year with sediment and losing storage. Essentially, there's only so much water that you can hold because the lake level is set. And so as you deposit sediment on the bottom, it's just like you have a drinking water cup, and if it's half full of mud, there's just half as much space for water. And over time, you're getting less and less storage, more and more mud, less and less water, and you can't drink the mud. And you can't use the mud for cooling for power generation, for cooling. And so it's a big deal. This map here shows you what percentage of the multi-purpose pool or the conservation pool, so the part of the lake that's usually full of water, what percentage is left. And so the top number is as of 2024. So for instance, the number here at Tuttle Creek Lake as of 2024 is about 51% is left. So we've lost about half the original volume of the lake. And you can look at Canopolis. It's also in bad shape. It's also filling in considerably, not quite as quickly, but it's several decades older than Tuttle Creek Lake, so it's further along the path of filling in with sediment. And then Perry kind of stands out as the number 3 for the lakes that are in this map here. The next number is after 25 years, what do we project for how much storage is left after 50 years and after 100 years? So if nothing is done, we're just marching on this path to one degree or another with all the lakes of filling in with mud. And I say mud, sand and gravel at the upstream end, mud kind of down towards the dam. Here's another graph that kind of shows the same thing, but including the rest of the federal lakes in Kansas. And the other lake that I would point out is John Redmond. What's showing here is the total size of the graph is the original capacity, and then the 50-year projection for how much of that is left as water is in blue, and how much is sediment is in brown. So you see Tuttle Creek Lake, very large storage, but it'll be almost completely full of sediment. And then John Redmond is also going to be almost completely full of sediment. And that is especially important because there's a nuclear power plant downstream that depends on that water. So reservoir sedimentation is really the #1 water supply threat for eastern Kansas. As important as the Ogallala is in western Kansas, the reservoirs are for eastern Kansas. Thousands of acre feet of water storage are being lost every single year. And without intentional significant action, the lakes will fill in with mud. And then the cities of Manhattan, Topeka, Lawrence, and Johnson County will be without water during a major drought without intentional significant action. And the uncertainty in that is a matter of when, but it's not uncertain that that will happen at some point. Right, so I'm going to kind of put this in a national perspective a little bit. I will talk about briefly reducing sediment loads coming into the lakes, and then I'm going to talk about two projects, the water injection dredging demonstration project at Tuttle Creek and hydrosuction at John Redmond, and then talk briefly about some next steps. So I've analyzed lakes across the Corps of Engineers portfolio, 162 lakes where there was enough data to do this analysis. And this is a distribution of how much of the original storage is remaining as of 2024. So we see that there are some lakes that still have, 80 to 100% of their original storage. So there are quite a few lakes across the country that are doing okay. But then we start seeing some lakes that have been impacted. There's only 60 to 80% left. There's only 40 to 60% left. And then there's a couple that are already in that there's less than 40% left of the original storage. So, there's a real distribution of how bad this is impacting other states and the lakes nationally. But just so you see, Tuttle, Redmond, and Canopolis are 3 out of the 7 that are in this kind of 40 to 60% left category. Perry, Elk City, and Council Grove fall within this category here. And you might wonder about what about these 4, sorry lakes there with hardly any storage left right now. Those are in Oklahoma, Iowa, and Ohio. So it's definitely a Midwest issue where, prairie streams historically carry a lot of sediment, and then plus all the, conversion to agriculture that's happened in the watersheds, there's just a lot of sediment. And so this is definitely more pronounced in the Midwest. But there are these same problems even in California and overseas. Like, it's kind of a worldwide problem. All right. Everybody always says, well, can we stop the sediment before it starts, basically? Can we keep it on the landscape? And so just to briefly address this question, can we reduce the sediment loading to the lakes? The answer is, to some degree, yes. Some amount is worth doing. There is a little bit of low-hanging fruit. However, and it's a big however, the benefits might take decades to accrue. We have been doing very significant amounts of bank stabilization upstream from some of these lakes for 20 years. But if you look at the sediment rating curve, so the USGS measurements of how much sediment's coming in, it hasn't changed. The same amount of flow is bringing in the same amount of sediment as it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. So we haven't seen those benefits. It may take decades to see those kind of benefits. The next kind of however is the cost of doing the work on the landscape is about 3 times more expensive per cubic yard of water storage that you get than the cost of doing it in the lake. And this is, I've heard people say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's not the case here. There is a lake in Iowa that did this, really, lots and lots of sediment reduction. It was cover crops, it was buffer strips, things that you would think of, but it was also building dozens of sediment traps, kind of like mini dams throughout the whole watershed, just with the purpose of trapping sediment. And outside of the liability and what do you do with those when they're full question, which wasn't really factored in, just taking the cost and the design life and how much sediment they would trap, it still equals to about 3 times the cost of what John Redmond dredging was. So, working in the lake is actually much less expensive than working on the landscape. The other issue here is the benefits are uncertain. So there's a little bit of work suggesting that the way that we stabilize one bend might actually destabilize the next bend. And that might be something where the designs can be tweaked to not get that effect, but there is some indication that might be the case. So you may not be getting as much benefit as you think you are. And then there are new ideas on how to do this less expensively. Because if you're going to build something out of rock, you usually want it to stay in place and it's got to be pretty solid. But if you're going to do 1,000 of them, which that's kind of the scale you would need for a watershed like Tuttle, is like 1,000 projects, not a dozen projects. Maybe it's okay if some of them fail, and you can build lower tech, lower cost things out of wood that might fail, and it's okay because you have 1,000 of them. So there's some active research needed on some lower cost methods. So this isn't off the table completely, just a little bit of realism that no matter what you do in the watershed, you're going to have to be doing work in the lake as well. All right, so talking about now Tuttle Creek Lake water injection dredging. So you're probably familiar that there was what we'd call a traditional dredging project done at John Redmond Lake a few years ago, where the sediment was excavated with the cutter head, which is like a giant chainsaw that stirs up the sediment, and then a suction pipe, and there's diesel pumps or there's electric pumps that supply the power to pump usually thousands of feet, and you pump the sediment into a confined disposal facility. So there's a lot of aspects of that can be quite expensive, even if in general John Redmond was quite cheap as far as dredging projects go. You're still supplying a lot of diesel to do all that pumping of your sediment slurry, and then the cost of disposal is about half the cost of the whole project. So water injection dredging is something different that has the promise of being quite a bit less expensive. Let's see if this video is going to work. So what we have here is a big flume. It's down in Mississippi, but we put sediment from Tuttle Creek Lake in the flume. And so the movie's actually a lot smoother, just at communicating somehow with your screens does this. But you inject water down into it, and it stirs up a muddy layer. And that layer, that kind of muddy water layer, is denser than the water up above it. So kind of like a salt wedge can travel on the bottom of a river, just because it's denser water. Sediment-laden water can travel on the bottom of a river or a lake because it's just denser. Kind of similar as well to like if you have oil and water in a jar, how the heavier water sinks to the bottom and the lighter oil goes to the top. This is kind of a similar mechanism at work. I'm going to attempt to play that one more time. You can also later, there's a YouTube link, and then you can see it very smoothly. So they inject water into the sediment, and it just stirs it up. This flume is actually completely flat. There's no slope on it at all. But just because they stir up the sediment, then it starts to travel. So we've seen that this can work with Tuttle sediment, and this kind of dredging has been done in some channels, and navigation channels, some ports and some harbors at different places around the world, especially in Europe, but a few places in the United States. But it has never been done in a lake setting before. So our Tuttle Creek Lake water injection dredging demonstration project will be the first time in the world that this technology is used in a lake setting. So that's big. But the dredge that you see there is a dredge from North Carolina, just kind of showing you, there's a big metal riser with water jets, and you're just injecting clear water into the upper, sort of layers of the sediment, and it stirs it up, creates that muddy layer that then travels down slope by itself. So instead of pumping a sediment slurry thousands of feet, you're pumping clear water tens of feet. So there's a very significant potential cost savings in terms of energy. And then you're not disposing of the sediment on the land. What you do is you just open up the gates and you're passing the sediment downstream. So the concept is all the sediment that enters the lake, you're trying to pass it downstream kind of at the same rates as that it's coming in. This demonstration project will be the only Corps of Engineers lake that is intentionally passing sediment for the purpose of managing sediment. There are some Corps of Engineers lakes in the Pacific Northwest where they draw the lake down to pass salmon, and they pass a bunch of sediment at the same time, but that's kind of an incidental benefit. This will be a project where we're doing this on purpose. We're trying to get sediment out of the lake, and it'll be the only one that's doing that by passing it downstream. We will be moving dirt this summer. The date that we have now from the contractor is August 14th to actually start moving dirt, and to last 10 days in the summer, and then a short pause, and then again in the fall, probably in early October, start again with another 10 days. The idea between the break is there's a lot of things to figure out on how this will work in a lake. You know, should you start at the dam and move upstream, or should you start upstream and move downstream? Or should you go up and then down on the same line? You know, how fast should the dredge move? So those kind of questions. So we're dedicating our first 10 days of dredging to trying out different parameters and finding out what's the optimal way to operate this kind of dredging in a lake. And then after that, we'll be trying to operate that way and see how much sediment can we actually get out and what will be the cost per cubic yard for this kind of dredging. The contract has been awarded to Michaels, which is a large, very large construction company that has done dredging and has done river work, worked with the Corps of Engineers on some Missouri River things in the past, but they're a very large company. And then the dredge is being fabricated by Custom Dredge Works, which is in Topeka, so they're here local. And so it'll be, fabricated there in Topeka, or here in Topeka, and then transported and assembled on site. But it's kind of it is a custom dredge for this situation, to have a riser that can go down far enough to get all the way to the bottom of the lake to inject the water. And I mentioned trying to pass the sediment downstream, and we are passing it downstream, or will be passing it downstream, not to exceed the natural level of variability in how much sediment comes into the lake. So what you see here, each dot represents a measurement of sediment concentration in the water flowing into the lake. And so we know for a given flow rate how much would be a natural level of sediment to pass downstream. And so we will be staying below the top dash line in terms of how much sediment we pass downstream. If we can get up close to that top line, that'll be hugely successful. So that gives us plenty of room to work with to make sediment releases. The goal of this project is to answer questions. It's not trying to get a certain amount of sediment out of the lake like a typical dredging project would be. It's to answer questions about the technology. So how can we operate optimally? What's the production rate in cubic yards per hour? What's the cost in dollars per cubic yard? And then what are the implications downstream? Because again, this is also the first time, certainly for this area and in general for the Corps, that we will be passing large amounts of sediment downstream on purpose. And so how does that impact the ecology? How does that impact the water quality? Excuse me. We've done a lot of background research on these questions, but we'll also be testing and monitoring very closely during the test so we can answer all these questions. So then if it comes to long-term implementation, we'll have answers to all these questions. Like these are the trade-offs when you pass the sediment downstream. Okay, that's Tuttle Creek Lake, and it was funded by a congressionally directed funds and earmark from Congress, but also then with $2 million from the state of Kansas. And so that's water injection dredging for Tuttle. The next thing is John Redmond, and John Redmond is different, and a main reason why, well, several reasons, but one is just the infrastructure itself. So at Tuttle, the picture on the left, the gates are right at the bottom of the lake. So you can open up the gates and you can pass that turbid water downstream. At John Redmond, the gates are 21 feet up off the bottom of the lake. And so it'd be much harder just to try to pass sediment downstream through something like water injection dredging. So we're looking at a different technology for John Redmond. And the technology is hydrosuction. So it's essentially the same concept as siphoning gasoline or anything else if you've ever siphoned something. Whereas if the discharge is lower than the point, than the water level, then the siphon can power itself, basically. Once you get it started, it can just start flowing. And this has been done in the United States on some small dams where the pipe went up and over the dam. And once they got it started, it just kept putting sediment-laden water up and over the dam. So a small dam in Nebraska did this a couple decades ago. And if the dam is tall enough, though, you can't go up and over. There's a physical constraint there. But you could still go through. If you have a way to get from one side of the dam through the dam to the other, then you can power a siphon. Just the water storage powers it. You can stir up the sediment, but you don't have to supply the diesel to pump it. So it can be a significant cost savings because of that. And then you're passing it downstream, so it's significant cost savings of not trying to dispose of the sediment. John Redmond has an unused water line. It has a conduit running from one side of the dam to the other. The state of Kansas paid for this a few years ago, and it's not being used any longer. So it's kind of a perfect location to use this technology or to try out this technology because the dam doesn't require a huge retrofit to do it. There's already a conduit there. There is a company from Norway called Sedicon, which has done half a dozen of these kinds of projects around the world, especially in Central America and South America. There's several of them. And here's an example from a project in Guatemala. And it's pretty similar setup to John Redmond in that they connected to an existing conduit and they're passing sediment downstream. And it's a lower tech kind of operation. You know, you don't need the big cutter head to stir up the sediment. They use some water jets to stir it up. You don't need huge pumps for pumping because, again, they're only pumping water down to the bed to stir it up, but they don't have to pump the slurry. The slurry is being transported with that siphon action. And so the Water Office has contracted with Sedicon to do a 35% design and cost estimate for John Redmond, which will give us a good idea then of, well, how much might it actually cost to implement something like this at John Redmond? And they're looking at it two ways. One is if it's a temporary demonstration project, kind of like Tuttle, or if it was a permanent installation, how much would those two options cost? Now, Tuttle has a benefit that also Canopolis and Perry have, in that the sediment that leaves those lakes free flows from their tributaries down to the Kansas River, to the Missouri River, to the Mississippi River, all the way to the ocean. And there's no other major impoundments. There's just little weirs and things. John Redmond, the sediment that leaves is going to flow into another lake, which is in Oklahoma. So the downstream channel issues related to pushing sediment downstream, they're just a lot more complicated when it comes to John Redmond than for Tuttle or some of the lakes in the northern half of the state. So that's probably the longer lead item is not going to be the technology, but it's going to be the downstream channel coordination, permitting, et cetera. So that's just to say there's going to be a longer lead time to getting this done. And so if you want to get it done, you need to start working on it right away, so that because it's going to take some time. And those issues won't resolve themselves without someone intentionally working on it, because we've been talking about this for a while, and the lakes are still there, and we still haven't really coordinated that because we know that there's not really a benefit for that downstream lake. They're just going to get more sediment. So there might be regulatory changes needed at the federal level, and a lot of interstate coordination for this kind of thing. All right, so then that said, next steps. There are engineering and technology kinds of next steps. To take a demonstration project, for instance, at Tuttle Creek Lake and change it into a long-term plan, there's some engineering and analysis to be done there. Environmental permitting for sure, especially at John Redmond, but at any given lake, and then funding. So, it's one thing to have funding for a short-term demo. It's another thing to say, and now we're going to do this every year forever, because that's what you will need to do in order to manage sediment. Is you'll have to have something constantly going to pass the sediment downstream. The Corps of Engineers, talking with the Water Office, has some items kind of in the path going forward. First of all, Tuttle Creek Lake it's been requested as a major rehabilitation project, and it's been co-requested as a GI study, general investigation study. So major rehab is usually what you do if you need to do maintenance on the structure itself, on the gates or on the stilling basin, and they're major cost items. So you have to get special approval to do something that big. And so Tuttle Creek Lake has been requested under this kind of mechanism. And then a GI study is usually what you do for a new project, where you have to justify, is this economically worth doing? And oftentimes that's the way new studies get funded, is through GI. So it's been requested both ways. and in the fiscal year 27 work plan, but it's available then. The request is in, and it's available should a senator or somebody want to pluck it out. If congressionally directed funds is still going to be a thing, that's a possibility. And a major rehab project or a GI study could lead to a long-term permanent management plan with a state USACE, federal government cost share. And then the same has been done for Canopolis Lake. It's been requested and put into the fiscal year 27 work plan. At John Redmond Lake, there's been a request by the Tulsa District for a $4 million hydrosuction demonstration. They actually put it in the previous year, and it just wasn't selected. And they put it in again for fiscal year 27. It's under the flood risk management account, and it's a little bit hard for sediment management that's mostly impacting the multi-purpose pool and the water supply storage to score high enough against other needs that are really specific to flood risk management. So that might also be something that it will take congressional input to get that moved up on the list. But that amount is really based on a short-term test only, and there's definitely some lead time work to be done at John Redmond, as I said, coordination with downstream. All right, if this topic is really interesting to you, as I'm sure it is to everybody, there's some ways you can get some more information. For one, I would recommend there's a podcast. It's called the RSM River Mechanics Podcast. And there are 3 episodes where a colleague of mine, Dr. Stanford Gibson, interviews some experts about reservoir sediment management. And you get a perspective about the economics and sustainability, about some of the methods, what's being done in some other countries. Really informative. I think a very enjoyable podcast. But, I guess I would recommend that. There's also, I've got a video or 2 up that I would also recommend. But, okay. That's what I have for presentation, but what questions do you have?
Thank you, John, very much. Your enthusiasm just oozes. Committee, questions. Representative Roth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I might have a couple if that's okay. So when when I saw the picture of the water blowing the sediment up, which has probably been impacted down there for years and years and years, it probably takes a tremendous amount of pressure to do that. So as that sediment comes up and fills the water basin with the sediment, it gets real muddy. Do you know what the impact is to the water life there, as i.e. fish and other wildlife that's in the water?
You mean in the lake? Or?
Yes, in the lake.
So the sediment-laden water is going to hug the bottom of the lake.
Right.
You probably won't see any difference at the top. And we think that any fish in the area are just going to get out of the way. So in general, removing sediment from a lake is a positive. It kind of slows the eutrophication process of the lake. So in general, it could be a positive. But that's probably about all I know about it, not being a fish expert.
Well, okay, thanks. And secondly, so as that stuff comes up from the bottom of the lake, and then there's a mechanism to basically suck it out of the bottom of the lake where it's staying, correct? Because I'm thinking you have to have some kind of current to move that, otherwise it's just going to come up, then it's going to set right back down.
Right. So with if it were sand, it would do exactly what you said. It would come up and it'd come back down. But the sediment that we're targeting is in the lower, couple miles from the dam, and it's really fine clay. And so when you stir it up, you get that muddy layer, and it actually is going to travel. It'll travel down slope on its own all the way to the gate. So when the gate's open, there's a little bit of current right by the gate, but the main mechanism is actually not the current driving it. It's actually just the sediment being denser than the water above it causes it to travel. And the movie that I showed that didn't play all that well, that flume is completely flat with no current. So we know that sediment can and will transport on its own, I guess you could say. It's kind of a different way of moving it.
Okay. So if there was no way to actually get it out, it would just move down towards the dam and then settle.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank
Which
you,
might
Madam
be a
Chair.
long-term strategy, that you can operate the dredge continuously and move the sediment closer. And then when you're ready to make gate releases, then you can fluidize it again to get it to leave. So that might actually be a strategy long-term.
Thank you.
Other questions? Representative White, then Representative Bloom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You said something, August 14th is the scheduled day of trial or start. Is there also a flood scheduled for that day or a drought event? What would happen if either one of those natural phenomena occurred at the exact same time?
Right. So we are going to, prior to August 14th, fill the lower 5% of the flood pool, which is the flexibility that the Corps has to use the lower 5% of the flood pool. So we're going to store a little bit of extra water so that we can make the releases during the test and draw it back down to the usual multi-purpose pool level. So we think that we've run models on it, and the probability of it being good enough water is really high. So I'm not concerned about a drought condition. If there was a flood, then we switch to flood control operations. And if it was flooding downstream, we wouldn't put any extra sediment in, because you never want to be blamed for what happens during a flood, even if it wasn't you, right? But so that might cause a shift in the dates. But usually, then when it gets down low enough, we would shift it to then.
Thank you, and it's nice to know you're flexible.
Representative Bloom.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Good afternoon. How far can you work behind the dam before it just settles again? You said it just keeps moving. How far can you go back?
That is one of the big questions that we're going to be answering with the demonstration. If you inject the water one time, how far will it travel? In some scenarios, it could actually travel miles and miles underneath. And but based on that flume study, we think that it's more in the realm of a few thousand feet. And so depending on how close to the dam you are, you might have to inject it once and then go inject it again and kind of hop it closer to get it to leave. So the exact answer, we should have information after the demo.
If it's just a few thousand feet, a lake is long and wide, how many years would it take to even make a difference? Because there's always sediment coming in.
Right. Yeah. So this demonstration project is not necessarily going to make a huge dent in the total volume. It's going to be testing the technology, and we'll be getting out some amount. But in order to actually manage the sediment long term, you will probably need the dredge there all the time. So you'll be constantly either moving sediment close and staging it, or getting it to pass downstream.
Could we afford that?
Well, it is I can't answer that question for you. I can tell you how much it will cost, and also that if you don't do it, the lake will fill with sediment.
If you're just dredging it, and you're sending it downstream, isn't it just settling out and making more problems downstream? Aren't you just getting rid of one problem, which you're not even getting rid of, and then making another one?
Right, yeah, so for a lake like Tuttle, the sediment we expect will go all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. For a lake, but we have monitoring in place, so.
A lot of towns that drink out of that, though, on the way.
Correct.
Well, that settlement, is that going to goof them up?
That is one of the major things to be monitoring during the short-term test, is what the concentrations are as you move downstream.
If it doesn't settle, it's going to cause problems.
Right, if it doesn't settle, it'll still be something that the drinking water folks are dealing with right downstream. So that is, those are good lines of questions, and the benefit of a short-term test is we can answer them short-term and then understand really the trade-offs for a long-term plan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? If not, Representative Carlin.
Thank you. I'm sorry I had to step out, but this is an evolving thing. I didn't know when we started this what I know now, but I didn't hear if you said, how long is this part of the project, this testing, going to be done?
Right, so it will be 10 days in August, 10 days in October. We are talking about getting additional days in 2026, specifically to test it in the spring as well, so that we have a summer, fall, and spring, all three kind of major seasons, specifically so we can monitor and test things in the channel downstream. But that, as of right now, we're talking about that, but we've got 10 days in the, summer and 10 days in the fall.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I have a couple questions. First of all, I appreciate the large print on this. There are several handouts that we get throughout the course of this session where I actually brought a magnifying glass to my office so I could look at them. If you look at page 7 and the Tuttle Creek sedimentation progression, so by 20, and looking at the bottom of the graph, the Tuttle Creek Lake is approximately 35 miles long. Is that how I'm,
That,
roughly?
originally.
Originally,
Yes.
okay. And so by about now, it's only 10, there's only 10 miles that have water in it.
Yeah, that's about right.
That's scary. Another thing, I was really surprised when you said it costs more to try to do upstream prevention than actually dredging or hydrosuctioning or whatever, actually getting into the lakes or bodies of water themselves and pulling out the sludge. I was shocked to hear that, quite frankly.
And there is some amount of low-hanging fruit that you can do that's cost-effective, but then you're getting maybe 1% of the problem. In order to get a significant quantity of sediment, then it's about 3 times, just going off the best example we have, which is the lake in Iowa, it would be about 3 times more expensive.
So what about going to the north end of Tuttle and dredging out all that topsoil and taking it back to the farmers that have lost it?
Yeah, so
Is
that would be more expensive, we think, than what we're proposing here. So if your goal is a cubic yard of water storage, it's going to be cheaper to get it close to the dam than it is further upstream.
Okay.
However, if someone wants to come and take it, that would be lovely, right? I think there was actually a law passed in WRDA from a few years ago saying that is allowed. Now, no one's, to my knowledge, actually tried to do it, so it would probably be the first time, and they'd have to work through things, but yeah.
Okay, and another question. You were talking about doing it, like right at the base of the dam and then maybe going farther back and farther back to see how that would flow or when it would settle, at what point would it settle? Would it settle after a mile or would it settle after 2,000 feet or whatever? So you don't have the answers to any of that because basically the dredging and the hydrosuctioning have never been done in Kansas before. Is that correct?
So correct on the water injection dredging. It's never been done in a lake anywhere before. There are some lakes around the world where sediment-laden water enters naturally on its own, and it plunges to the bottom and it travels for miles along the bottom. Those lakes tend to be steeper, and so there's something that Tuttle doesn't have, is it's not as underlying being as steep. This demo will answer that question, is how far will it travel before it settles out under the bottom, on the bottom of the lake.
So how are you going to monitor what's happening during those 10 days?
Yeah. So we've got several things by several different research groups. One is multi-beam sonar. So basically using boat-mounted sonar to get the elevations of the top of the muddy layer and then also of kind of the bottom of the bed underneath the muddy layer that was formed. And we'll be doing that before and after and during. And then the other thing is with some buoys, with instruments set up on the buoys that will be put in place as soon as the dredge passes. So we kind of got those two. And the Corps of Engineers in Kansas City, also our research group in Mississippi. Then University of Kansas is involved, K-State University is involved, USGS is involved, and the Bureau of Reclamation. So a lot of people that actually had their own funding pots as well are really interested in this project. And so we'll have lots of people trying to measure kind of similar things, but with different instruments, et cetera.
Okay, and one more question. You were talking about John Redmond, and that's Wolf Creek below there, right? And Wolf Creek needs water out of John Redmond to function. And so, but the downstream problem with that one, has anything been talked about with Oklahoma? Or are we just looking at trying to get this process figured out first? Because, yeah, anybody that's affected downstream that has to be worked out.
Right. Not much. There's been a little bit of a who's the right person that we should be talking to, but we haven't really had those conversations. And at what point do you want to? I've had some conversations with our headquarters regulatory on what the rules are. If a dam releases sediment, is it the rules in Kansas or is it the rules in Oklahoma? So there's been some thinking about it, but we haven't really talked with them directly.
Are there any dates on the calendar to do the John Redmond, why do I keep calling it Redmond? The John Redmond testing, yeah.
Right. No, the funding for the John Redmond project, there's no funding for it yet. So,
Cut out, yeah.
yeah.
So KLRD just informed me that the Senate put 3 million in for that just this morning. So for John Redmond, yes, yes. So any other questions for John? Representative White.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's more of a comment. I've been trying to sell this to people, why Tuttle Creek is more important than just the water supply of Manhattan. The Corps, you named a bunch of people with our departments with their finger in the pot. You know, the Corps owns half the water in Tuttle Creek. They are bound by whatever law to maintain a stream flow. That stream flow is the water supply of every little community in Topeka. And the Chairman Minix often says, you know, everybody's upstream and downstream in the state of Kansas. And that's kind of, if you think about that, this is important to people in Kansas City. This is important to every little community before and after. It really is. It's not just the city of Manhattan, and people think, oh, who cares? K-State. I'm a K-Stater, so thank you, Madam Chair.
On that point, Johnson County Water One has been one of the biggest advocates for it. Even though it would be increasing the sediment in the water, you can treat dirty water, you can't treat no water. So that's and they're far, downstream, but yeah, they see that it's important.
Representative Carlin.
Thank you. And to follow up with Representative's point, during the flood of 03. 03. 93. Oh my God, it was 30 years ago.
There's one in 93, because
I know, I was sandbagging.
I was one of the last ones across the dam before they closed it.
Oh my gosh. Well, I was on the city commission, and it was like my first 2 months on the commission. Here we are. But that's when I learned that the water had to be we had to flood a part of our city because of the Corps of Engineers use of their plan of the use of the water to save people upstream. So I still don't, you might be able to talk a little bit, just say a little bit about that, because I didn't describe it very well, but it was, I didn't know that. And so it's part of the flood control, and that's the major reason.
Yeah, when you switch into flood control mode, then there's like a real defined process because someone's being impacted, And so all of that had to be decided ahead of time because someone gets impacted. It's upstream or it's downstream or, dam safety conditions and whatnot.
We actually had to sacrifice homes. That was part of the deal. So it's a valuable resource and for a lot of people. I think it went clear back to the Mississippi River flood control. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments about dredging or hydrosuctioning? Okay, I just want to echo what you said at the very start, that 2/3 of Kansans depend on reservoirs for their water supply. So that's 2 million people depend on bodies of water for their constant water supply. So this is pretty important. Appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Good afternoon, committee. My name is Victoria Asbury with the Kansas Water Office, and thank you for having me to talk about our House Bill 2302 grant program this afternoon. We've had a lot of engagement with this program, so I'm glad to be able to provide an update today. And I'll let my slides pull up. Okay, so first I wanted to start with the funding for these grants. So many of you will remember that the 2023 legislature passed House Bill 2302, which allocated an additional $35 million from the State General Fund to the State Water Plan Fund for the next 5 years. So that bill does sunset at the end of fiscal year 2028. Of that $35 million, $18 million stays in the State Water Plan Fund for water projects and programs related to the Kansas Water Plan. $5 million goes to this first grant program, that's the Technical Assistance Fund, and $12 million goes to the Water Projects Fund, and that's that second grant program that I'll talk about. So $17 million is our base funding each year for the next 5 years. However, last year, the legislature added an additional $10 million for the grant program, bringing the technical assistance total to $7.5 million and the water projects total to $19.5 million for fiscal year 2025. So now that we've talked about where our funding comes from, I want to touch on each of the grants themselves. So the first is the Technical Assistance Fund, and I want to share that everything on this slide is laid out in statute in House Bill 2302. So first, the eligible applicants. There are 2 categories of eligible applicants for these grants. First is municipalities, and the second is special districts related to water. So think rural water districts, conservation districts, watershed districts, and sewer districts. Any district established with a purpose related to water could apply for these grants. The second, I'll talk about eligible projects for the Technical Assistance Fund. So in statute, planning, engineering, managing, or other technical assistance necessary for water infrastructure projects. So the first question, what is water infrastructure projects? It's not defined in statute. So we take a very wide definition. So it does include drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, sewer, all those things are eligible projects. And when we talk about technical assistance, think about preliminary engineering reports, design for a water infrastructure project, or studies that might need to be done in order to get ready to complete an infrastructure project. So basically everything that needs to be done before actually breaking ground would fall under the Technical Assistance Fund. So the second eligible project type is the processing of grant or loan applications for water infrastructure projects. So maybe a community is interested in pursuing a federal grant, but they need to hire a grant writer to help them pursue that grant. Our funds, the Technical Assistance Fund, could be used to hire that grant writer to pursue that larger federal grant. And then finally, limits on awards. Statute does limit the amount of each technical assistance fund to $1 million. So each community could only receive a grant of $1 million per year. So the second grant I want to talk about is the Water Projects Fund. And again, everything laid out on this slide is in statute in House Bill 2302. This grant has the same eligible applicants, so municipalities and special districts related to water. Eligible projects, construction, repair, maintenance of water-related infrastructure. So you've done the work to get ready to break ground, and you're ready to break ground. This is what those funds are for, to actually complete the water infrastructure project itself. These funds can also be used as matching money for grants or loans for water-related infrastructure. So maybe you're pursuing a federal grant that requires a match. These funds could be used to provide that match for that federal grant. And then finally, we call it loan assistance. The House Bill 2302 does allow these grants to be used for loan assistance, but only for two specific KDHE loans. That's the Public Water Supply Loan Fund and the Kansas Pollution Control Revolving Fund. So a community who has a loan through KDHE, one of these two loans through KDHE, could apply for loan assistance to help pay down that principal balance of that loan. A question we get pretty often, are USDA loans allowable? No, it's just these two KDHE loans. And then the limit for the water projects grant is $8 million per grant. So now I've talked about each of the grants themselves. I want to talk about how we evaluate our applications each year, starting with your application materials. We recognize that we're working with really small communities who don't have a full-time mayor or a full-time city clerk, let alone a grant writer. So we've tried to make the application as straightforward as possible so that it's accessible to those small communities. So first, we require a project plan and objectives, so including a clear and specific definition of need. This is that, what are you doing and why are you doing it? Tell us what you're wanting to do and why it needs to be done for your community. A scope of work with deliverables. This is the, how are you doing it? What are the steps you need to take? And when are you going to have it completed by? So that's that first application material we require. And the second is a budget. So a budget with allowable costs within your timeline. So making sure that what you're requesting funds for is related to water infrastructure projects as laid out in statute. Professional cost estimates. We recognize that we're working with small communities, but you can't just hand me a Post-it note that said this project will cost $50,000 and I'll give you a grant. So we need to a professional cost estimate from an engineer to verify that that's how much the project is actually estimated to cost. And then finally, that the budget aligns with your requested funding amount. Maybe you're utilizing multiple funding streams, which is great, but we at the water office need to make sure that we know exactly what we're paying for. So making sure that the amount you're requesting matches up with your budget, and we can tell what our funds would be used for going forward. So after we've reviewed your application materials, we also have some evaluation criteria that we use to review applications. So these first two are laid out in statute. House Bill 2302 requires us to prioritize municipalities with fewer than 2,000 residents for grants. So that's that first evaluation criteria, again laid out in statute. And the second, also laid out in statute, is community factors. So the water office is required to consider criteria including public health and socioeconomic factors. Public health and socioeconomic factors are not laid out in statute, but just as some examples, for public health, maybe your community is out of compliance for KDHE standards, drinking water standards, you have nitrates or some other contaminant in your drinking water. Socioeconomic factors, what's your impact to your water rates? A lot of these communities can't afford to fund the project within existing resources, so they would have to increase their water rates in order to pay for the project. Or else maybe talk about your demographic factors. Is your community below the state poverty level? Do you have a population towards disadvantaged communities? Things like that. They aren't laid out in statute. So we do have a, try and include as many factors as possible to allow communities to meet that criteria. The third criteria we consider is emergent issues, projects that address urgent circumstances related to water infrastructure. This is kind of that next step up from the public health factor. So maybe your community is under a boil water advisory. Maybe you're having to bring in water, truck in water from another source. You can only drink bottled water. Is there an emergency that your community is currently facing that would bump up your application on the list under our criteria? The third is regionalization. So projects that support regionalization will be prioritized. I want to emphasize that this is not a requirement to receive a grant. It's more like what I describe as bonus points. The Water Office emphasizes creating a secure water supply system, so projects that create a backup source for communities, so you're not relying on one water source. Creating a more secure water supply system will receive what you could call bonus points for your application. And then finally, a conservation plan. Projects that incorporate a conservation or climate change plan will be prioritized. Again, this is not a requirement to receive a grant. It's one of these bonus point factors. We want not only for your project to provide water for your community, but to protect the resource. So maybe your project incorporates a reuse and recycle factor. Maybe it would reduce water loss, protecting the groundwater levels or the levels of water coming from the reservoir in the future. So not only providing water for your community, but protecting the resource into the future. So I mentioned that the Water Projects Grant can be used for loan assistance, and these criteria are laid out in statute for the loan assistance. In order to receive a grant for loan assistance, your project must be complete. So you also must have made 5 years of payments on your loan to be eligible. And then there's a scale, as you can see, about how much your grant can pay off your final balance. So 90% of your, you can receive a grant that would pay off 90% of your balance if you have a population 2,000 or less, and so on and so forth down the scale. So to give you an idea of how the program is operating so far, so fiscal year 2024, our first year of funding for the program, we received 309 applications in a 6-week period. These applications totaled $380 million in requests, and as a reminder, we had $18 million available to award. So if you're ever looking for a demonstrated need, this is an easy one to point to. There's far more requests than we have funding. For our first year, we were able to award 34 grants, totaling $18 million, 19 technical assistance grants, and 15 water projects grants. And on that map, the blue dots are awards, and the tan dots are those that were not awarded. Fiscal year 2025, we just made award announcements in February for our second year of funding. We received 269 applications, totaling $233 million, and we had $27 million available to award. So again, that demonstrated need is still there for the program. This year, we were able to award 70 grants, totaling just over $26 million. 39 technical assistance grants, and 31 water projects grants. And I'll point you to the handout that was provided to you. It has all of our 2025 awards with the community, the project title, and the amount they were awarded. I don't have them all memorized, so if you have a question on a specific award, I'm sorry, I'll probably have to get back to you, but we're happy to provide that information if you have a question about a specific award. I did pull a couple of examples from the list to give you an idea of the evaluation criteria in action and the types of projects that are awarded. So first, Jewell County Rural Water District received a technical assistance grant. They'll be using those funds to complete a preliminary engineering report to construct a water tower to store water from its secondary water source. So there's that regionalization criteria that we talked about, securing a secondary water source for the community. They also noted that their groundwater wells are experiencing elevated nitrate levels, so there's that public health criteria that we were talking about. And they'll also use the grant to drill test wells to determine the source of the nitrates. So they're using the grant for a couple of different things to move them toward a water infrastructure project that will be constructing a water tower based on their technical assistance. The City of Ellis also received a technical assistance grant. They'll be using those funds for design and modeling to improve their water infrastructure system, water distribution system. Sorry about that. They noted that their system is in danger of falling below minimum pressure levels, which can lead to leaks and contaminants. So a different form of that public health criteria that we talked about, still contaminants, but rather than in your water source, it's affecting your distribution system directly. The centralized system can better detect leaks and manage repairs, reducing the water loss. There's that conservation criteria that we talked about, making your system more efficient in conserving water. And then the applicant noted specific and calculated impact to water rates. So there's that socioeconomic factor. How is it going to affect your community to implement this project without the grant? And one more example I have for you. Receiving a water projects grant. They're looking to rehabilitate their water tower. The paint on the water tower is currently testing positive for high lead levels. So again, that public health contaminant criteria. And the applicant noted demographic information such as poverty rates in disadvantaged communities as compared to the state of Kansas. So there's that socioeconomic criteria that we talked about. So the last thing I want to touch on, after we've evaluated the applications and made the awards, what does it actually look like at the water office when we're administering the grants themselves? The first thing I want to note is that we do run on a reimbursement model, so we do not provide any funding upfront. We do that for a couple of reasons. From the water office side, it increases our accountability and allows us to protect the funding that we do have. By running on a reimbursement model, we're able to verify that the funds are being used for allowable expenses and towards the project that they applied for. Each quarter, awardees submit reports and invoices that we use to verify those expenditures, and then we distribute a payment as reimbursement for those invoices that they provided. And the last step for verification that I want to share is that we have contracted with technical experts. So I am not an engineer in any way, so some of this goes over my head, the nitty-gritty of the projects themselves. So we've contracted with technical experts who will review the project at the midpoint and at the completion to make sure that it was completed to the standards that would be expected, and that what was completed was actually what they received funding for. So just that extra check to make sure that the funds are being used as they're supposed to be. So if you're interested, or if any community in your district is interested, we do have a website that contains information, guidelines that have a lot of the information that I just walked through, evaluation criteria, application materials, things like that. A frequently asked questions document. We receive a lot of questions during the application period, and so we try and have a frequently asked questions document updated as often as possible to answer some of those questions. And then example documents. What are we looking for in a budget document? What ranks as a good budget document, and things like that. So all of that's available on our website if anyone is interested. Yeah, thank you again for your time today, and I'm happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Questions from the committee? Representative Roth.
Thank you for the presentation. I just got a question about, I see on page 7, you say that a community has to be paying their loan back over 5 years before you'll consider them for repayment. And so that's probably, in some cases, quite a bit of interest for a small community to be paying out. So why is it 5 years and not 2 years or 3, or, you know?
Sure. Honestly, all I can share is that is laid out in statute, so that was not the water office's decision, and that's not a conversation I recall having while the bill was being worked. This is my personal thought, is that it shows responsibility on the part of the community that they have made the payments, and it's kind of there to use a common phrase like skin in the game. If we're going to help you with loan assistance, you know, you've at least put some of your own money into it, and also just again that responsibility that you've been making your payments. But again, that's just laid out in statute, and that's my personal view, not the legislature's.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And also, say that a community just absolves itself of caring for their water supply. And so the system gets terribly, terribly bad. And then they're in crisis mode where they're unable to get water or drink potable water. And so then they're asking for some help. Does their responsibility, because you just talked about responsibility for paying the loan back and holding them accountable for paying a loan back and then having to pay a lot of interest for a small community, because I heard one representative talking about a small community doing a chili fundraiser for their water supply. And so I'm just thinking here that if a community just ignored the maintenance on what they should have been doing to maintain their water supply, how do you respond to that? Do you just jump in and give them a grant or a loan to help them in a critical situation because of their negligence? Or is there some accountability, like you just mentioned, in paying back the loan?
Sure, yeah. It is definitely a difficult situation that we still face with our awards because now I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth, so I apologize for that. There's a certain, do you punish the citizens of the community because their leadership or whoever chose, or even, you know, past leadership chose to let the infrastructure deteriorate and didn't maintain it? So that's tough, but I know I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth with the accountability. But I would say in response to that, on our side, we do have that same technical expert that reviews the projects for completion, reviews our applications, and they do flag for us if a community has been negligent in maintaining their system, and whether it's their belief or understanding that they might struggle to maintain it in the future. So it is something that is flagged for us and something that we consider. So I know I'm talking like I'm a little bit contradicting myself, so I apologize for that.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, to repeat the question for anyone that's listening online, the representative asked if, looking at the statutes, if there's anything the water office could see that would need adjusting in order to manage the program, and hopefully I summarized that accurately. It might be something I have to think about, but at this time, no, we're fortunate that the statute is specific, but not so specific that it's restrictive. It's really helping us fill a gap that a lot of other grants don't provide. So for instance, a lot of other grants don't allow for like design or final design. They don't define that as technical assistance because technical assistance wasn't restrictively defined in the statute. We are able to fill that gap that a lot of other grants. So at this time, I can't think of anything, but I'll definitely think about it and let you know.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions? I have a few. How long from the time that someone, what is the time frame for turning in grants, first of all? Is it like from January 1st to March 15th, or what is that?
Yeah, so we're only in our, we just finished our second cycle, and so we anticipate using this time frame going forward. We opened in July and closed in September. So that's our application period, and we anticipate using that again this year.
Okay, and then when a city or municipality turns in their grant, say September 15th, how long before they hear whether they've been accepted or denied?
Yeah, so this time, we made award announcements in February. So, and that's just due to the sheer number of applications that we receive. It just takes that long for us to do our review and then also coordinate with our technical experts and other state agencies that we need to run by. So this year we made award announcements in February. Of course, we would like to go faster, but I'm not going to promise that in the future.
Well, when you've got 269 to go through, it takes a little while. And so on your evaluation criteria page 6, are those are in order of priority, correct?
So yes, like the population receives the most weighting is the word I'll use. Community factors receive just a little bit less weighting, and then the last three are kind of grouped together in their weighting.
Okay. And then on page 7, the community pays in for 5 years. They apply for help to finish paying their loan. That won't pay for the whole amount, no matter what it is, right? There's a limit to what you can give to those communities towards their loan.
Correct. Yeah.
And, okay,
Yep, so that scale that you see at the bottom of the slide, so at most, if we can do 90%, if your community residence is 2,000 or less.
okay, but say they owe $200,000, you will pay 90% of that?
Correct.
So that money's more than what is in HB 2302, as far as what you're able to give out in a year.
So, I mean, so are you saying, like, if someone's loan was $27 million?
Yeah, yeah, sorry. I
So-
said 200,000. I meant like,
200
if they owed 200 million, there's no way you could cover.
No, that's true,
whole-
yeah. Yeah, fortunately, we haven't crossed that bridge yet, but yes, so that we would have to then revisit whether awarding that one community $27 million versus awarding 69 other communities a grant, for sure, yeah.
Okay. And so your office goes through and evaluates all the applications, and then your technical engineer,
Correct.
that's who decides who gets the money?
Right, I would want to emphasize, they review applications and give us their opinion, but it is the water office's decision in the end, which applications we award.
Okay, thank you. And on this grant list for this year, Jewel County and Randall and Washington County and Cuba were all out of my district. So I was tickled to see that announcement.
Coincidence, but a
Yeah.
fortunate one.
Yeah, so any other questions or comments for Victoria? Representative Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for being here today. Thinking about a circumstance that happened close to my district, and I think everyone knows that Kearney County was experiencing some naturally occurring contaminants in their water to no fault of their own. And those contaminants got to a threshold that something needed to be done immediately. And of course, the problem cities and counties have when they reach that critical junction is, now we're needing a $10 million water treatment plant. So we've got to have time to bond that. We've got to have time, and everyone knows that water rates may double to pay for some of this stuff. My question is, counties and cities, before they get all that done, and these are high dollar projects, is there a bridge loan outside of this grant program that these cities and counties can use in Kansas to get them till they have time to bond and get things straightened out? Because some of this is kind of an emergency situation, right?
Right, yeah. I don't want to get out of my lane and speak for other state agencies, but there are other agencies that offer loans or grants related to water infrastructure. So KDHE, when we've talked about their loans, may not be as responsive. Department of Commerce does offer CDBG grants, which you can use for water-related infrastructure. KDHE had funding for some grants for water-related infrastructure. So there are other avenues. I'm not comfortable saying which one would be best for like an emergency situation, like you need money next month. But there are other avenues, and we do share that information with our non-awarded applicants. We have a lot of awardees who are still looking for, or applicants who are looking for other sources of funding. So we try and share that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Final call, comments, questions? Seeing none? Thank you, Victoria. This was a very educational day. I appreciate the Water Office coming in. No meeting tomorrow, no meeting on Monday. On Tuesday, we're going to hear from the Animal Commissioner, Dr. Justin Smith from Kansas Department of Agriculture, on the foreign animal disease exercise that the Kansas Department of Agriculture holds every December. It promises to be a very enlightening, informational hearing. So we'll see you all on Tuesday, and with that, we are adjourned.